come from, it's time to take a look at the current landscape. And to do that, we have Nathan Mifsud from our community's Innovation Lab team. He's not the rocket scientist, he's the, not brain surgeon, but I'll tell you a bit more about him in a moment. In fact, Nathan is a data scientist working to build the data capability of the Australian social sector. In his work at our Innovation Lab, Nathan has consulted with not-for-profit organisations of all sizes, delivered collaborative projects with child service and addiction support agencies, facilitated data science tutorials, and run events to foster Melbourne's data for good community. So we're working really hard to make more data scientists interested in the not-for-profit sector and the social sector. Previously, Nathan did research in youth mental health and higher education, and he has a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, which is a bit more of a sophisticated way of saying what I tried to say a minute ago. Nathan has more recently taken a deep dive into the Smarty grant statistics to discover what the current state of play is in the grant-making world. And we talked before about privacy and data, and Nathan's about to show you one way that we can use data without undermining any ideas of privacy. So he's here today to share his findings with you. So I'll hand over to you, Nathan.
Thanks, Kathy. Morning, everyone. Today I'm pleased to be sharing with you, as Kathy mentioned, some of our early analysis into grant applications that flow through Smarty grants. I want to highlight to begin with that the pretty charts that I'll show you come off the back of a long effort to auto-classify subject areas and beneficiaries, an effort led by my colleague Paula, who's the principal data scientist at our community. I'd also like to acknowledge that I speak from the unceded land of the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the elders of this land and the elders of the lands from which you're watching. Now, I don't know how many of you pay attention to the lunar cycle, but maybe you stepped outside in the last few days and noticed it was a bit darker than usual. And that's because we had a new moon on the weekend. And for those of you in Melbourne, you would have seen that the new moon was accompanied by a really big downpour, a full day of rain. And those two signs together augur the new season that we're in here in the Wurundjeri land, called Wundabit Tadul Marguk. The season roughly spans the 4th lunar month, and because it's a time of rain, we kind of have indoor activities. And traditionally, this has been possum skin cloak making and rug making, preparing for the chilly seasons ahead. Now, in hundreds of years past, newborn babies throughout Victoria and New South Wales were wrapped in these cloaks. These were tapestries of up to 30 skins, and they were marked with stories that told of the baby's people and land. Often these cloaks are composed of panels that were designed and contributed by different members of the community. The cloak pictured here, I don't know where to point, but the cloak that I've got on the slide there was produced in 2006, and it focuses on Taungurung creation stories, and I've put a link there if you'd like to learn more. Now, if you'll allow me to draw a connection from, I'm being told to walk towards the mic. I've been told, I just said that, if you'd like me, if I could draw a connection now to today's talk, it reminds me of the fact that when we look at data in aggregate and we look at it, these numerical sums, as I'll be showing in the slides to come, these are constituted by individual stories and experiences. And so as individual grant makers yourself, you're dealing with many different communities and lives. And I think that's important to keep in mind, even as we look at this, look at these numbers and look at this data, that they're bound up by threads of individual people. So even though it's valuable to identify broad trends, it's always good to keep in mind, how this can benefit individuals and individual communities. Okay, with that in mind, let me share my own patchwork creation here, which is, it's not warm or water repellent, but it is very practical as a table of contents. So I'm going to start by looking at the big picture. So setting up some context for what will follow, which is 2 different ways of slicing the data. So first I'll look at funding flows, which is total funds dispersed. And second, I'll look at approval rates, which you can think of as the likelihood that a grant will be funded. And I'll wrap up by speaking about some challenges that were faced along the way and what comes next. Okay, big picture. In other words, why should you care? And what the heck are we going to be looking at? Well, By identifying where grant money flows, my hope is that you'll get a broad idea about how the social sector in Australia is operating, with a focus on those changes that coincided with the spread of the pandemic over the past year. This could give us an understanding of the needs and patterns of support that we see and prompt some reflection about your own grant-making behaviours. It's also worth keeping in mind that data is always a subset of reality, like these Matryoshka dolls. For example, I just mentioned that I'm going to be looking at the social sector in Australia because that's the data I looked at for today's presentation. But I'm aware that some of you may be watching from New Zealand, where things may look a little bit different. And even for those of you that are in Australia, I want to emphasize that our data is a sample of grant maker activity. If you'll know from reporting on your own data, there are inevitably data quality issues such as missing fields, which I'll touch on a bit later. And of course, not everyone watching today is a Smarty Grants user. And that shows that it's, again, just a sample of what's going on. As you'll see later on, state and territory government grant makers predominate in our data, even while you might expect there to be a lot more funds from federal government. So this means the charts that I show today won't perfectly represent all grant maker activity, but it's the best indication that anyone has right now of what's going on. One last picture slide, one last thing to keep in mind, which is that when I show charts that involve subject areas and beneficiaries, it's important to keep in mind that these were auto-classified. It wasn't a human sitting down and selecting each one. You'll see from the sheer number of applications that that's not practical. So we automatically determined these subjects and beneficiaries. Not by a robot exactly, but by an algorithm of the sort that runs this kind of modern technology. Now, the word algorithm might scare some of you, or maybe it'll make some of you immediately tune out, hopefully not. But just remember, it's a set of instructions for the computer to listen to, like a recipe. Given some input, like beans and rice, any algorithm worth its salt should spit out a burrito. Or I'll give you a more practical example. In our case, the classification algorithm that we designed was fed the text fields of grant maker applications, things like the project description fields. Now, based on the rules that we specified for the algorithm, it then looked at each application in turn and said, oh, okay, I think that it belongs to this subject area, or this beneficiary might be who is benefiting from this application. Does that make sense? Well, I say that hypothetically because I actually can't get any feedback from you, but hopefully it does. All right. So to start, how many applications do we analyze with this thing? So here is a chart showing the cumulative number of applications. All told, we're looking at over 500,000 here. You can see time on the horizontal axis at the bottom there, and the increasing curve represents the increase in number of applications over time. Remember, of course, that this is Smarty Grants data, so the accelerating increase in applications is probably mostly due to new customers coming on board, rather than the average grant maker experiencing an increase in applications year on year. Still, you'll notice that last year in particular, from 2019 to 2020, was a bit of a step change, so the curve got steeper. And because of that, I wouldn't be surprised to hear from many of you that there was a real jump in the number of applications in 2020 compared to 2019. Similarly, we can see a transition here. If you look at the, say, for example, the green slice, which is local government, you can see that in the early years, that was really predominating in terms of number of applications, whereas now it's about 50-50 between state government and local government. And so this kind of tells a little bit of a story about how Smarty Grants has evolved over time. We've had more state and territory government grant makers come on board. The same is not true for funds allocated, and this is what Kathy alluded to a few minutes earlier, which is that even though state, territory, and local governments are at parity in terms of number of applications, in terms of actual funds allocated, the state, territory government makes up the lion's share. So all told, we analysed over $6 billion in cumulative grants allocated over that 8-year span. And this is big bucks, but remember, it's only a subset of what's going on. Because in order for me to, when I'm analysing it, know how much funds were dispersed, the funds allocated field had to be filled out in the Smarty Grants application. So if you're a Smarty Grants user, you're a grant maker and you don't use that field, those applications won't be reflected in this chart. So I think it's a no-brainer to say that the actual number of funds flowing through Smarty grants is actually substantially higher, let alone in the wider sector. Okay, moving on, this is kind of a different way of slicing the previous data here. So now we've got just a month-by-month comparison of the previous 2 years. So here, each percentage number is showing the increase, or in the case of February here, slight decrease for 2020 compared to 2019. So for example, in March, there was a 40% increase in funds allocated in March 2020 compared to March 2019. Now, there was a huge spike following this in April and May, where in April we saw 300% more funds allocated in 2020 compared to 2019. Now, of course, that coincides with the national wave of COVID throughout Australia. And even though I said earlier that increases in these numbers are a combination of increases in Smarty Grants users and actual sector increases, I think it's fair to say that given the distribution of the increases here, that we're seeing a real increase as a response to COVID. Another interesting thing from this graph is that it dries up in the second half of the year. And so it's almost as if there was a redistribution across the pattern of the year. And again, remember this is aggregate data. So maybe for some of you, this is an accurate reflection of what happened in your own grant making practices last year. But for others, it may not be. But we're looking at things overall as an indication of how the sector responded. Okay, now with all that sort of context in mind, let's move on to funding flows, which you can think of as funds dispersed and where it's being dispersed. Click. I skipped one. So here I've got a chart that I'm only showing one at a time here, just so we get our heads around what the chart is showing us. So the green bar here represents the funds allocated to particular subject areas. Now, in the classification taxonomy that we use, some of you might know it as classy, there's 17 different subject areas that we can categorize grant applications as falling into. Here, I've chosen 6 that I'll carry through this presentation to focus on, kind of somewhat arbitrary, but also the ones I think you'll find most interesting given what's been occurring and given where most of the money flows. So here the green bar, as I said, is the funds allocated. The black dot is an example, not an example, it is an indication of the funds requested for that subject area. So the first thing we can immediately see is that there is a large gap, which suggests unmet demand. You might also, some of you might immediately think, well, it'd be very interesting to make comparisons based on the percentage of funds allocated compared to the funds requested. That's somewhat akin to approval rates, which I'll talk about in the second half of the presentation. So I'll just bring up the rest now. So the 6 that I'm choosing to focus on in this presentation: arts and culture, community development, economic development, health, science, and sport and recreation. We can see there straight away, there's large amounts dispersed to all of these areas and a drop in science. Now I've included science, you know, I am a scientist, so of course I wanted to include science, but also I thought it was somewhat relevant given COVID, and we'll see in comparison, we'll see in conjunction with approval rates later on an interesting story emerge. But also here, just to illustrate again, the limitations of the data, right? Of course, science receives far more than the 100 million that's put there, but most research grants don't flow through Smarty grants. So again, I just want to make clear to you, be transparent about the fact that we have to interpret these figures with care. And that's why when the reports come out, more detailed reports based on this analysis, we'll have all those things in mind. So this is a good indication of funding by subject area. Let's look at another fun thing. We'll break it down. We'll add another dimension here, which is organization type. So now what I've done is shown you subject ranking by funding. So what I mean by that, each square here shows you the ranking for that organization type and that subject area. So the darkest squares are those that are highest priority. The palest squares are those that are lowest priority. So if I highlight one for you here, that's the darkest square in the matrix. That indicates to us here that philanthropic foundations and trusts, in terms of the funds that they dispersed, prioritized health as number 1. And this is an overall view across all 8 years of data that we have. I'll introduce time again soon. Conversely, if we look at the palest square in the matrix, we can see that that's science and local government put science last in terms of the funds that are dispersed. So that's out of the 17 subject areas that we can classify. So this matrix, I think, as I've been talking, a lot of you, if you already got it, are probably jumping in and thinking about the various different things it's telling us. I'll just point out, first of all these charts I'm showing are kind of just an example of what we can do as a kind of sneak peek for a more detailed view down the line. But I'll just point out here 2 things, which is we can look at it horizontally, which is a grant maker view. So here we can see federal government and look at its relative priorities in terms of funds dispersed. Here we see that they prioritize arts and culture and economic development above community development, which is being picked up by local government, if you can see the darker square for local government and under community development, which kind of accords with what we would think based on the kind of grants that local government typically is involved with, that they're closer to the community in that regard. We can also look at vertical cuts of the matrix, and that you can think of as the grant seeker view. So here, if you are a grant seeker and you've got a grant that relates to community development, you're most likely to get your funding from local government. So again, 2 different views of the data here, illustrating the potential power of this kind of analysis. And you can, look at different columns here and look at different things. So if you've got a science-based application, you're most likely to get funding from philanthropic foundations and trusts. That's the darkest square there. Okay, moving on, we've got a fun thing here. Again, you can see I'm stepping you through one dimension at a time. So here we had, so back here, if I skip all the way back, we had subject area, funding by subject area. Now I've added organization type. And then finally, instead of organization type, we're looking at time. So here we can see how subject priorities have changed over time. Each line here represents a different subject area. There are 17 lines in total. The top line is the highest ranking. The bottom line is the lowest ranking. The first thing that you might look at before you even know what any of the lines represent, if you just look at the broad pattern of things, you can see it's a bit of a mess on the left-hand side, potentially because we had less data there. There's all sorts of different users coming onto the Smarty Grants platform. But we've been a pretty big platform for the last 5 years, and you can see that the subject priorities are relatively stable, which I think is quite interesting in itself. But there was a little bit of movement last year, potentially as a result of COVID. So if I pull out, again, those 6 subject areas that I've been focusing on throughout, first let's look at community development and science. We can see that the priorities for those were roughly stable across the whole time period, even over the last 2 years. Based on the fact that community development's above science here, you can tell that it's a higher priority for grant makers on average. Again, on average, some of you, it might be the other way around, of course. If we look at sport and recreation and health, we can see that generally speaking, they're very highly prioritized. Now, some of you might be immediately surprised to see health drop in the last year. Well, that might be, that points us to the fact that it's important to consider different perspectives of the data. And so later on, we'll think about it in conjunction with approval rates to find out what might be going on there. And remember, this is priorities, not total funds dispersed. So, well, it's priorities based on funds dispersed. And so even though health was a lower priority, I can tell you from looking at the data that the overall funding did increase. It's just that other priorities increased at a greater rate and took over it for that year. So hopefully that clears that up. What were those subjects that were taking higher priority? Well, primarily economic development. So for 2020, economic development was the #1 priority, which it hadn't been any previous year. So it really came to the fore. And again, I think that accords with the fact that we were concerned with maintaining businesses and livelihoods throughout the COVID period. We can also see an interesting thing, and this is a surprising result for me, I thought, was arts and culture was relatively stable. If anything, the priority went up one. So that in itself is quite interesting, and I'll come back to it in time. Okay, so I've looked at funding flows. Now, as I keep saying, let's look at it with approval rates in mind, because some of you are really large grant makers, some of you are much smaller grant makers. It's not exactly fair to be comparing apples for apples there. I don't know if that's the right term, but instead, if we look at approval rates, we can get a kind of a relative picture of things that will further inform what we just saw in the charts. So just to remind you, approval rates, there is a formula that I use to calculate it, but essentially it's just, percentage of applications that were approved. So it's the likelihood that a grant's getting funded. If you're a grant seeker and you submit an application to one grant maker, if that grant maker has a higher approval rate, it means your grant's more likely to get funded. So here we can see the breakdown of approval rates by organization type. The thick orange line is the average approval rate. And then because as a theme that is coming through, perhaps you might notice, I like to always keep in mind the diversity of the data. I've included individual grant makers as a thin gray line, so you can see how that average was actually calculated. So if you're a Smarty Grants user and you're watching this, you're probably represented by one of those thin lines. So straight away, we can see a few different things. I'll focus on local government here because I find it the most interesting in terms of the pattern that's happening here. So overall, if we ignore 2020, it was very stable. So that not only was the approval rates higher than all other organization types on average, in 2019 it was 70%. Not only was it very high and very stable, we see that there was this dramatic drop in 2020. Grants were less likely to get funded by local government on average. The flip side happened for federal government and state territory governments, where they had roughly 48 and 51% approval rates in 2019. This jumped an equivalent amount in the opposite direction to the local government. So you're more likely to get funded if you're submitting a grant to federal or state territory governments. And we saw smaller jumps for philanthropic foundations and other organization types, which includes corporate grant makers, educational institutions, a whole range of smaller grant makers. So again, very interesting. And again, it raises a lot of questions, questions that I don't necessarily have the answer to right now. Maybe I'll get more of an insight if we dig deeper into the data. But I think that this points out the fact that with all this data analysis, what it does is not necessarily give you the answer or tell you the exact decision. It informs you about what's going on. So it prompts questions. And so if you're a local grant maker, for instance, I'd be very curious to hear about your personal experience and maybe hear about your theories as to why maybe the sector on average, or that organization type on average, had a drop in approval rate. And that applies to all of these charts. If you have any thoughts, I don't know if people are, Kathy, if anyone's chatting in the thing, perhaps you are. I can't see the feed. I can see about 5 other screens. If my head's waving about crazily, it's because I have no idea where to look. Okay, with approval rates now, I'm going to look at it in a slightly different way. We're looking now at, we've bucketed the grants based on how much they were requesting. So we can see here how likely a grant was to get funded based on how much money it was asking for. So I've got a series of lines here. The left-hand figure of the line represents 2019. The right-hand side is 2020. We see here that for grants that were requesting less than $5,000, they were quite likely to get funded, especially those less than $1,000. It was 80% in 2019. Slight drop in 2020, but that's not hugely significant. It's pretty stable for those two. It wasn't quite the case for the middle bit. We saw these dramatic jumps in approval rates for grants between $5,000 and $50,000. Again, we can drill deeper into that. I'm curious to hear about your own experiences. One theory that comes to mind straight away is that it might be related to that economic development we saw before. That's kind of the kind of ballpark figure. Whoop, I touched the mic. Ballpark figure for those kind of grants, and we can see that they jumped in approvals there, which matches the jump in economic development priority. Things were more stable at the top end. If you were asking for over $50,000 all the way up to $1 million, you were roughly as likely in 2020 to be approved as you were in 2019, again, on average. Now, a slightly different view, again, still approval rate, so it's still the same basic metric of how likely is a grant to get funded, but now we're looking at the subject areas and we're looking at it over time. So we get a picture here about how likely a grant for here, for example, arts and culture, how likely it is to get funded over time on average. And I've started with arts and culture because it's very stable. And it also points to the fact that earlier we saw that funding priorities for arts and culture went slightly up, but the approval rate has remained stable. So this might suggest that, for example, it could be the case that there were about the same number of grants getting funded, but they were getting funded with slightly higher amounts. If I bring in two extra subject areas here, sport and recreation and community development, we see very similar stable patterns over time. And we can also see that because they're higher up, they were more likely, if you look at the vertical axis there, they're about, what is that, about 20% more likely to get funded. So quite a significant difference there in approval rates. In other words, if you're a grant seeker and you submit a sport and recreation focused application, you're far more likely to get funding than if you are from an arts and culture organization seeking funding. Oh, I also threw in an extra little detail there in terms of the thickness of the line, just to give us an indication of the data we're looking at. So if it's a thicker line, it's more applications. And so here we can see that, you know, it gets thicker over time because that matches up with the patterns we saw earlier, where the early years of Smarty grants, not as many users, not as many applications, but we can be more confident that those approval rates represent what's going on in the later years. Now, if I jump to the last three subject areas that I've been focusing on, economic development is the one standout here again, where not only did we see a jump in approval rates, a huge jump there, about 15%, when it was already relatively high compared to, say, science. Not only that, but we see that the line got a lot thicker. And so there was, again, a steep increase in the number of applications relating to economic development. So we're seeing a pretty clear picture here, no matter which way we slice it, as to how we responded last year. It's nice to see that in the data, because it means that other patterns that we identify, we can have confidence in. And here we see science, it's a thin line, but so there's fewer applications here compared to the other two subject areas. But again, there was this jump, quite a dramatic jump in approval rates. So this suggests that even in the subset of the data that we had access to, those grants that were relating to science, even in that small pool of science applications relative to everything Smarty Grants looks at, there was this jump in science-based approval rates. And I think that's quite interesting. One analysis that would make sense to do from here is see how many of those are actually related to COVID. Was it a general science bump, or is it the case that they were just more COVID-related science applications? So again, it prompts questions for further reflection and consideration. Just a couple more charts to finish before I move on to challenges. I talked earlier about beneficiaries being something that we can classify according to. So this is, I want to make clear what populations the algorithm thinks the application would benefit if it was to get funded. So for example, if I look at, if we say that it was unemployed beneficiaries, that obviously means that we think that this application would fund and benefit persons that are unemployed. It's not to say that the grant seeker is unemployed. And that sounds like an obvious example, but I'll also show a slide showing male and female beneficiaries. So again, I just want to iterate, I'm talking about these grants are thought to benefit males or females. It's not that we could identify the gender of the actual applicants. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll move on to my first chart. So this one, I think, is telling us a plain and simple story, similar to the economic development one we saw earlier. There was this huge jump from 38 to 55% over the past year for grants that were benefiting unemployed persons. It's kind of interesting that it fluctuates over time as well, perhaps in response to need, one would expect. Now, I also said I'd show a comparison here of grants that benefit people that identify as male, grants that benefit people that identify as female. And we can see here, this was a surprising result for me and some of my colleagues. We thought it would be the other way around. We thought that female beneficiaries would be more in need, and one would expect approval rates to reflect that need. But actually, it's the other way around. Across time, we see here that male beneficiaries are more likely to get, applications that would benefit male beneficiaries are more likely to get funded than ones that would benefit females. This gap narrowed in 2020 slightly. Be curious to see whether it opens up again in the following year or two. But I think the trend is clear there. If we look at the year-by-year funding there, it's quite a marked difference. One thing I'll point out here as well is you'll see that the red line there is a lot thicker than the male line. This is indicative of the fact that there were more female applications, female beneficiary applications, and this is partly because the algorithm was less restrictive for female beneficiary applications. In other words, to make sure that, for example, let me step back for a sec. So you might wonder, for example, how can we be sure that it would be benefiting females or males? With respect to the male sub area, it was very restricted. So we're looking at keywords, things like masculinity, men's sheds, prostate cancer, things like that. So though it was highly restricted, definitely only primarily benefiting males, whereas the female algorithm rule was a lot more open because there were much more areas of need. Things like obstetrics, femininity, feminism, women's rights. There were a whole range of different subjects areas related to this. So again, if anything, this makes it makes me more certain that this is a real trend we're identifying. So that's problematic, I would say. Okay, with that in mind, let me move on in the last few minutes to some challenges. What were the challenges to get to this point? The first is the need for algorithm testing. So we need to be very careful that what we're seeing, is as accurate as it can be. And so this is complicated again by the classy taxonomy that underlies things, because that is a living document. It changes over time. So populations might be added or merged. For example, in the most recent iteration of Classy, they added the category pregnant people. And part of the reason that I didn't really show you many beneficiary charts is because we're still finishing our testing of all these new populations. So we identified, I'll give you one example, we identified one problem with this pregnant people keyword rules, which was the word delivery. So originally it was included to capture grants that may be related to the delivery of babies through, a stalk through the air. Of course, some of you might immediately think, well, that could capture all sorts of things, like project delivery. It could be anything to do with construction or a more abstract project delivery of creative projects and so on. So obviously, delivery there is a little bit ambiguous, and we want to refine the keywords for that particular population. As an example of how that might actually impact the data, you can see here that if it's picking up more applications than it should, that would lead to it appearing to be a really higher priority than it should be, higher priority than it is in reality. So it would have twice as many funds allocated to it as you would expect, for example. Everything that I've shown you today is based on like months of careful testing, a lot of hard work, mostly done by Paula, who I mentioned earlier. That's why I didn't show everything today, but there's hundreds of categories in Classy, so there's a lot of stuff to look forward to in time to come. One other thing is data limitations, of course. So as I just mentioned, the algorithm, as much as we test it as hard as possible and as thoroughly as possible, it's only ever going to capture a subset of the rich complexity of the English language and the language that grant seekers choose to use in their applications. And of course, grant makers themselves don't always use all the fields that we're interested in for analysis. So if you're a Smarty Grants user and you don't use decision status, you don't go back and put in funding allocations, or amount requested isn't used in the forms, then of course we can't include those applications in some of our numbers. So there is limits to the data that we're using in that respect. Finally, I just want to end on the note that especially when it comes to actually putting out reports, as opposed to what I've shown you today, when putting out reports for public consumption, we want to be careful that we're considering all the different sources of bias that might feed into our interpretations. So if we see differences in funding and approval rates, like some of the differences you've seen on the previous slides, there's a whole different set of things that could be feeding into that. It could be differences that are due to applications aligning to the guidelines that you as grant makers have set out. Could be due to deliberate preferencing of some groups due to a real or perceived need. You might actually, of course, put out a round to address that need, and then you're going to be preferencing those groups. There could be unconscious bias in assessment, of course. It's impossible to get away from that, and that's another source of bias. Quality of applications can come into it as well, where two applications, one from a group that's better resourced than another, or is coming from native speakers versus those that have English as a second language. They might be equally deserving of funding, but it's not quite reflected in their application. And then lastly, of course, the data quality issues I already talked about, in terms of we want to be sure that the algorithm is introducing as little bias as possible, and that the data we have is as representative as possible of the wider sector. So just a few caveats to finish. So let me point out that this was just a sneak peek of the final analysis to come. It's going to be partly guided by questions that people have, not just now, but if you email us down the line, we can feed that in. So please do feel free to start conversations with me and with our community and with each other. So just to sum up very quickly what I covered today. We saw that funding allocations spiked in April and May and then dried up. We saw that economic development became top priority, and it appeared that arts and culture was stable. Of course, perhaps there was a redistribution of funds there. Maybe some arts and culture organizations benefited far more than others, but just at an overall aggregate level, it was stable, which I thought was quite interesting. Approval rates dramatically increased for federal, state and territory governments, as well as philanthropic trusts and smaller grant makers. There was a dramatic drop in the approval rates of local government. We saw that grants with female beneficiaries were less successful on average than grants that would benefit male beneficiaries. And of course, there are ongoing analysis challenges, but the reports will feed the conversation. And if you're interested in how this might translate into, if you're a Smarty Grants user and you're interested in how it might translate into ways that you can analyze your own data, Sarah, who comes after me, may touch on that. And I think there's going to be some conversation about it in Friday's talks. So thank you. And there's my email if you want to reach out.
Thank you, Nathan. That was a very deep dive into the data, but there's a lot deeper that we can go because of those hundreds of classifications. Right. I think Nathan's shown us how dipping into the data actually raises questions as much as answering them, which is something that I always find. I also wanted to say to you all out there that if you're a data novice, I'm very much a data novice. My background is as a journalist, but I'd just like to really encourage you to engage with data, because you actually know a lot more than you think you do. And the subject matter expertise coupled with the data expertise is just a really dynamite combination, because you actually know a lot of these answers. And to illustrate that, Nathan, I've got some comments that I can read out here in relation to your question about why did we see that dip in the local government stuff, approval rates. So let's see if I can find them. There were a few here. Our council declined a large amount of local government, local event applications at the onset of COVID restrictions that would normally have been approved. So I think we saw priorities shift there. That was from Kerry. Jeremy from Sydney says the City of Sydney processed 6 years worth of applications in 6 weeks at peak COVID. So there was so much unmet demand, and that reduced our approval rates significantly. So again, there's some really great insights there. And Simone says, our grant pool got split in half to fund business recovery as well as community grants. So you can see that split happening. And another comment I would make on that is in relation to the taxonomy that underlies all of this data. Up until a couple of years ago, the taxonomy included community and economic development as one top level classification. And I think if we hadn't made that split a couple of years ago, the stats we saw here today would be very different. So I think that's interesting to note as well. There's so much that goes into this. What else can I read out here? There's a lot of appreciation for your data visualizations, which are very clear. Someone is asking, you may not be able to answer all these off the top of your head, but I'll throw them at you anyway. Which category does environment and sustainability sit into? I think Paola could probably answer that. I'm not sure.
I believe there's a separate environment category. It's just called environment. But one thing that I didn't touch on in this presentation, and if you're not familiar with Class E, you may not be aware of, when we say there's hundreds of classifications, you think, well, hang on, didn't you say there was 17 subject areas? Well, there's different levels to it. It goes down to level 4. And so within, for example, arts and culture, there might be 10 at level 2, which then gets broken down again. So we can really fine tune and slice it. There's a separate environment category, and within that environment category, there'll be lots of ones different related to conservation and X and Y and Z. And yeah, Paola knows it much better than I do.
Paola has spent hours and hours down in a dark room working out all the keywords and getting that algorithm working. So she knows it very intimately. Rebecca asks, and I don't think I can answer this, but I'll read it out anyway. Out of interest, what proportion of government funding is administered through Smarty grants versus other portals? So we don't actually know the exact answer to that, but it's something that we'll be looking into, pulling in data from other sources, including our Easy Grants database. Well,
that really is $1 million question, right? We would love to be able to have that data source, but it doesn't exist right now. It requires work to pull them all together and work out what's happening in the sector at large.
Jamie says, hi, Nathan and everyone. Re the low approval rate of 40% in health for philanthropic trusts, my category. It would be interesting to find out whether or not that is likely to be a result of a very large volume of grants submitted for this category, or if it's more a function of application quality. Does anyone else have working in this category, have any further insights or experiences to share? Or is there anything that we could dig in to find that in the data?
I can definitely look into that. That is data that I have available. There's just a limited number of charts that I can overwhelm you with.
This is a question actually about the visualisation. I like using line thickness to correlate to application numbers. I really love that as well. When trying to create visualisations for a portfolio of grants of vastly different values, do you favour looking at grant numbers or grant value? So I assume that means how many grants you gave out versus how much money you gave out.
Yeah, it's a good question, and you get different stories from either approach. As you can see that I did in this, the answer is always both. Why not both? Because they tell you different things, and together you get a better picture. So it's always better to have a couple of different views. You don't want to have your interpretation skewed by only looking at one at a time.